people like to tell this story as if it began with a sigh and ended with a kiss. A king fell in love, gave up a throne, and followed his heart. It sounds lovely, right up until you remember that hearts do not usually rearrange constitutions, terrify governments, wound mothers, exhaust brothers, and alter the childhood of a little girl who would one day become queen by the time Edward VIII said he could not do his job without the woman he loved. The palace was not watching a romance. It was watching a pattern finally collect its bill. Long before he became the most inconvenient bridegroom in Europe, he was simply David to his family. That was the last of his given names: Edward Albert, Christian, George Andrew Patrick David, and it was the one used at home. He was born in 1894 into a house that had rules for everything and feelings for almost nothing in public. The family business was monarchy, but not the fairy tale sort with jewelled smiles and effortless charm. The real business was duty, routine, appearances, paperwork, church, hierarchy, and the endless management of other people's expectations. In that world, being born first was not just a privilege, it was a sentence written in gold ink. His father, the future George V, believed in work, discipline, and self-control, with the fervour of a man who distrusted almost every other human improvement. His mother, Mary of Teck, later Queen Mary, was formidable in the way a cathedral is formidable. She could be deeply affectionate in her own style, but she loved the crown less as an ornament than as a sacred trust that existed before any one person and would continue after them. She admired steadiness, seriousness, obedience, the clean fold of a napkin, and the proper use of rank. She did not raise children so much as train heirs and survivors. David was handsome, early, charming early, restless early. He had the bright surface that makes adults say, "What a delightful child," and the inner impatience that makes nannies tired by noon. He could be warm, engaging and funny, but he also wanted attention as naturally as other people want air. He did not much. There was another problem, less visible but more important. He liked affection but resisted authority. He liked adoration but disliked the grind that usually earns it. He liked intimacy when he set the terms, not when duty did. In a less dangerous family, this might have produced an amusing eldest son with expensive habits and 2 ruined marriages. In a royal family, it produced unease. His parents did not merely worry that he would embarrass himself, they worried he would misunderstand the job itself, enjoy being managed, which was awkward because nearly everyone around him was employed to do exactly that. A prince is expected to learn performance before he learns power, and David learned the performance well enough. The trouble was that he also learned how intoxicating it felt when a room tilted toward him. That job had changed by the time David came of age. The British monarch no longer ruled by personal command, if indeed that had ever truly been the whole story. A modern sovereign had to do something more delicate and, for some personalities, more maddening. He had to embody continuity while accepting limits. He had to be visible but not intrusive, important but not openly political, ceremonial yet somehow still emotionally useful to millions of people he would never meet, and it was part priest, part actor, part constitutional machine. The person in the role could be charming, but charm was not the main qualification. Reliability was. David was never reliable in the way his parents understood the word. He was often dutiful in bursts, then bored, then resentful of the very structure that gave him his stage. He was educated for royal life, spent time in the Royal Navy as a young man, and served during the First World War, though not in the sort of front-line role he might have preferred. His family, government, and military superiors were not about to risk the heir to the throne in a dramatic death that would have devastated the monarchy and delighted the enemy. So he did what many princes do. He served near danger, saw enough to be changed by it, and returned with a stronger sense that ordinary men lived harder lives than the people who wrote the seating plans at court. That mattered. One reason he became so popular in the years after the war was that he seemed less upholstered than older royals. He travelled widely across Britain and the Empire. He met veterans, workers, miners, factory hands, and the unemployed. He could look at deprivation without pretending it was picturesque. He was not blind to suffering, and when he spoke sympathetically about people battered by the Depression, they believed he meant it. He had glamour, but he also had emotional fluency. Crowds loved him because he did not seem carved from marble. He seemed to notice them. For a monarchy still learning how to survive mass democracy, radio, tabloid culture, and the shock of the modern age, this was a gift. He looked magnificent in uniform, wore evening clothes as if tailors had been invented solely for his convenience, and understood public contact in a way that felt contemporary. He was perhaps the first British royal who moved like an international celebrity in the modern sense. People copied his clothes, women admired him, men watched him. Newspaper editors knew he sold papers. Courtiers, who generally dislike anything they cannot file, recognized that he had something rare. They also saw the price. He was casual about rules that others considered essential. He was careless with private boundaries. He liked a social world that felt looser, richer, and more entertaining than the official one. He gravitated toward married women, fast company, private weekends, and friendships outside the stiff old aristocratic mould that had shaped earlier royal circles. Some of this simply reflected the times. The old world had cracked after 1914, and younger rich people were not interested in behaving like memorial statues. But with David, the looseness was not occasional relief. It was preference. At the centre of that preference was his hunger for a place that felt like his. In 1930, George V gave him Fort Belvedere, an 18th-century house in Windsor Great Park. David loved it. He called it the Fort, as if the casual nickname itself made it more personal and less royal. There he could garden, entertain, escape Buckingham Palace, and build a social world that looked more like a private kingdom of taste than a formal extension of the court. He renovated it, modernized it, made it comfortable, and filled it with the sort of people who relaxed him. This was revealing. Most heirs are eager to master the institutions they will inherit. David was more eager to create a refuge from them. He liked being Prince Best when he could edit the role. He could be diligent in public, then retreat into a world where etiquette softened, schedules bent, and the right guest list mattered more than the right constitutional instinct. It was not that he hated monarchy. He hated the parts of monarchy that told him no. His younger brother Albert, known as Bertie, was almost his opposite. Where David was fluid, Bertie was effortful. Where David glided, Bertie laboured. He was shy, dutiful, and physically tense, burdened by a stammer that made public speaking miserable. He was not the glamorous son. He was the conscientious one, the sort of man who did not enter a room and make every head turn, but who also did not leave ministers needing a restorative drink. Bertie had married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, after a courtship that involved real hesitation on her part, because she understood exactly what royal life could cost. Their marriage, once made, was affectionate and solid. It produced two daughters, Elizabeth in 1926 and Margaret in 1930, and a home life noticeably warmer than the one in which the brothers had been raised. This mattered more than it seemed at the time. Royal history often turns not only on great passions, but on domestic comparisons. David had style, sparkle, and popular magic. Bertie had dependability, a devoted wife, and the kind of family life that reassures a nervous nation. To a parent deciding which son truly understood the monarchy, the answer was uncomfortable. The dazzling one drew crowds. The awkward one looked safer with the crown. George V was not sentimental about such things. He valued the institution above personal longing, and he had spent too much of his reign watching Europe's royal houses topple, flee, or shoot each other to believe that monarchy could survive on charm alone. The Russian Romanovs were gone, the German Kaiser was gone, thrones that had seemed ancient had vanished in a decade. Britain had survived the war, labour unrest, Irish upheaval, economic misery, and political strain, but survival had depended in part on the crown appearing stable, moral, and above personal indulgence. A sovereign did not have to be lovable. He had to be trusted. David increasingly looked like a man who preferred being loved. Then into this unsettled arrangement came Wallis Simpson. Not all at once, and not at first in some thunderclap of destiny. She was not a princess from a neighbouring court or a great English beauty stepping out of a portrait. She was an American, born Bessie Wallace Warfield in 1896, raised with social ambition, self-possession, and a sharp understanding that money and status are not the same thing, though they are forever trying to sit at the same table. She had married a United States naval aviator, Earl Wynne Spencer, in 1916. It was an unhappy marriage, marked by separation and instability, and it ended in divorce in 1927. By 1928 she had married Ernest Simpson, an American-born British subject in the shipping business, and settled into London society as a polished hostess, with a distinctive voice, good clothes, good instincts, and an even better memory for weakness. Wallis was not universally considered beautiful, which may have helped her. Beauty can make people lazy. She had to be interesting. She was quick, disciplined, observant, and good at the social arts that matter most in intimate circles. She knew how to listen without seeming submissive, flatter without sounding obvious, and cut a room with one dry little remark. Men often mistook this kind of skill for spontaneity. It rarely is. Wallis had trained herself for social survival long before she met a prince. She and David first moved in the same fashionable circles in the early 1930s. They were introduced in 1931 through friends, including Lady Finesse, who happened at the time to be one of David's romantic entanglements. It was all very civilized in the way only upper-class bad behaviour can be. People dined, flirted, visited country houses, and pretended not to notice arrangements that would have caused a vicar to swallow his napkin. For a while, Wallis was simply one more clever woman in a world of clever women. That was how such trouble usually begins. Never with a trumpet. Always with a seating plan. What drew him in was not innocence, because neither of them possessed much of that by then. It was something more adult and, in its way, more dangerous. Wallis did not tremble before him. She did not treat him like a sacred object from the Tower of London. She teased him, managed him, corrected him, and offered the one thing a spoiled and emotionally needy man often finds irresistible, the sense that a particular woman sees through him and still stays. David had spent his life surrounded by deference. Wallis gave him resistance with intimacy attached. That can feel to the wrong man like truth itself. What drew her in is harder to pin down, and that is one reason historians still argue. Some saw ambition, some saw excitement, some saw a woman who enjoyed influence without fully wanting the consequences. Some later argued that she had not intended to become indispensable, and was alarmed when the whole thing grew teeth. There is evidence enough across the years to support almost any version except the simplest. She was not a cartoon villain climbing a staircase made of men. She was also not a floating angel carried helplessly into history by love. She was worldly, strategic, and perfectly capable of enjoying proximity to power. But enjoying a prince at dinner is not the same thing as wanting to become the most hated future queen in Britain. By 1934 the relationship had turned serious, or at least serious for David, which was the version that mattered most. He became deeply attached. Friends and household staff noticed the change. He followed her lead, altered plans for her, and showed the sort of emotional dependence that unsettled people around him. Mistresses were one thing. A Prince of Wales had been expected, for generations, to collect complications. But a prince who appeared ready to reorganize his life around one married woman was another matter entirely. His parents were alarmed. George V had tolerated his eldest son's romantic carelessness with growing irritation over the years, but Wallis presented a different threat. She was married. She was divorced already once. She was American. She was outside the accepted range of women who could be safely kept near the heir without becoming a constitutional hazard. The King and Queen had met her, and any hope that she would be absorbed into the family circle with mild discomfort and strategic silence quickly died. Queen Mary's idea of social flexibility had limits, and Wallis arrived past all of them. David, of course, interpreted resistance as persecution, which was one of his lifelong gifts. To him, family concern could look like coldness, constitutional. Caution could look like cowardice, and objections to his judgment could become proof that no one truly understood him. This was not just romantic blindness, it was character. He had spent years feeling emotionally underfed by his parents and constrained by the machinery around him. Wallis did not represent only desire. She represented relief, alliance, private warmth, and a kind of chosen loyalty against the grey battalions of duty. That made her more dangerous to the palace than any passing affair had ever been. A mistress can be managed, a symbol cannot. Meanwhile, the outer world still saw the prince, not the emergency. The British press, obedient or intimidated or both, said very little about his private life. The public remained largely shielded from the extent of the attachment. In other countries and in private circles in London, gossip had long since broken into a run. But Britain still maintained that strange old agreement between Fleet Street and the establishment in which everybody knew and almost nobody printed. It was less a conspiracy than a habit of class solidarity, tinged with fear and convenience. If the monarchy could be protected by silence, silence would be found. Inside the palace, silence was becoming impossible. Wallis was no longer a rumour at the edge of David's life. She was near the centre of it. He wanted her included, respected, seen. He wanted the family to stop treating her like a regrettable weather system. They, in turn, watched with the dread of people who know a private weakness is drifting toward public consequence. Courtiers were not merely snobbish, though many were that with considerable talent. They also understood sequence. First comes the tolerated intimacy. Then comes the demand for acknowledgement. Then comes the insistence that exceptions be made. Then comes the collision with rules that have stood for generations. Human disasters often follow this timetable with admirable punctuality. In January 1936, George V died at Sandringham. The old king, who had spent years worrying about his eldest son's temperament, was gone. David became King Edward VIII at once. No coronation was needed for that. The crown passes in an instant. However slowly, the people around it breathe. And now the problem that had been domestic became national. Edward began his reign as he had lived, with style, impatience, and a visible preference for doing things his way. He was modern, handsome, and still deeply popular. He talked of economy in the royal estates. He took interest in the distressed areas of the country. He gave people the impression that something energetic might be coming. Yet from the first days there were signs that the private disorder had not been left behind with his old title. He broke custom by watching his own accession proclamation from a window at St. James's Palace with Wallis nearby. It was the kind of gesture some might dismiss as theatrical and harmless. But courts are like good dressmakers. They notice every stitch. To the palace and the government, this was not a small flourish. It was a signal that the new king did not feel bound by the emotional discipline of the role. That was the real beginning of the breach, not the later speech, not the famous phrase, not even the marriage question in its final form. The breach began when those around Edward understood that kingship, to him, was not an institution that set the terms. It was a platform on which he expected his personal wishes to be accommodated. And in Buckingham Palace, behind the polished doors and correct voices, people started to grasp that Mrs. Simpson was not passing through. She was taking a place in the story that would force everyone else to move. The trouble with putting a crown on a man who dislikes restraint is that everyone around him has to pretend charm is a form of government. For a little while that pretense almost held. Edward was dazzling in public, easy with crowds, modern in manner, and still wrapped in the goodwill he had built as Prince of Wales. People wanted to like him, many already did. After the stiffness of earlier reigns, he looked alive in a different way. He gave the impression that he might bring fresh air into rooms where the curtains had not been moved since Queen Victoria was young. But fresh air is one thing. A gale through the state papers is another. At court, the change in his status altered everything around Wallis Simpson at once. As prince, he could be reckless and merely cause indigestion in the palace. As king, every dinner invitation, every weekend arrangement, every appearance of intimacy acquired legal, political, and religious weight. A mistress in private life could be ignored, disliked, or managed. A woman who might become the king's wife was a national question wearing evening clothes. Edward did not seem to grasp, or did not wish to grasp, how quickly the ground had shifted. He wanted Wallis close. He wanted her treated with respect. He wanted his household and family to stop behaving as if she were some regrettable spill on a very expensive carpet. And because he was king now, he also expected resistance to soften. That was one of his deepest misunderstandings. He thought the throne increased his freedom. In the British system, it often reduced it. The palace moved at once into that special tone it reserved for disasters that must not be named in front of the silver. Courtiers became more watchful. Invitations were weighed like explosives. Household staff understood that access to the king had become one of the central questions of government, though nobody would have put it that way over soup. Ministers noticed, secretaries noticed, family noticed. Even the furniture, one suspects, began to look tense. Wallis noticed most of all. She was too observant not to. She could read a room, and the rooms of royalty were reading her back. A woman may survive one kind of social hostility. British royal hostility in the 1930s was another species altogether. It could be perfectly mannered and still feel like being lowered into cold water. There were no screaming scenes, no shattered crystal, no one flinging accusations across a drawing room. That would have been easier. Instead there were omissions, exclusions, changes of tone, carefully managed distances, the subtle but unmistakable message that she was not one of them, and never would be. A lesser woman might have retreated. Wallis had not built her life by retreating from difficult company. Nor did Edward make retreat easy. He became more attached, not less. The more the court disliked her, the more he seemed to define himself through his attachment to her. In this there was something adolescent and something tragic. He was in his 40s, yet he often behaved like a man discovering for the first time that the world might deny him what he wanted. Because Wallis did not bow and scrape, he took her firmness for authenticity. Because others objected, he treated the relationship as embattled and therefore profound. Forbidden things often gain emotional polish they do not possess in ordinary daylight. The king's working life did not reassure anyone. Edward was not lazy in the simple sense. He could work hard when interested, engage intensely when a topic caught his imagination, and show real sympathy towards suffering. What he disliked was regularity, paperwork, and the long grey discipline of constitutional kingship. He resented the daily burden of official boxes, memoranda, formal audiences, and the careful neutrality expected in dealings with ministers. He wanted to be active, not merely informed. He wanted to express opinions, not always swallow them. He wanted to intervene. This made Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, very uneasy. Baldwin was not dramatic by nature. He looked and sounded like a man who might apologize to an umbrella stand. But underneath the mild exterior sat a shrewd sense of political danger. He understood both Edward and the monarchy better than Edward seems to have understood either. What worried Baldwin was not only the affair itself. It was the larger pattern. The king wanted freedom where the constitution required restraint. He wanted private satisfaction and public exception in the same package. Governments can survive romantic foolishness. What they fear is a sovereign who mistakes personal will for national necessity. Edward also gave off a kind of modern celebrity electricity that could be politically unsettling. He was admired in a way that ministers never are. Crowds came for him, not for Baldwin, and certainly not for constitutional doctrine. That gave him a dangerous illusion. If the public loved him, perhaps he imagined, surely the machinery of state would have to adapt. The problem was that public affection is not a spare key for the Constitution. It opens fewer doors than people think, and almost none at Westminster. The religious problem alone was serious enough. In plain terms, the Church of England did not accept the remarriage in church of a divorced person whose former spouse was still living, and the king stood at the top of that church as its earthly head. One did not need to be a theologian to see the difficulty. If he married Wallis after her divorce, while both of her former husbands still lived, he would be asking the institution he symbolized to swallow what it officially rejected. That was before one reached the views of the cabinet, the opinion of the dominions, and the broader matter of public morality in an age that was not nearly as modern as Edward liked to believe. He had never much cared for being told that institutions had memories longer than his desires. There was another reason the palace did not forgive easily, and it had less to do with doctrine than with the shape of private life. The royal family had spent years, even generations, presenting itself as the stable heart of the nation. This was not entirely true, because royal families are families and therefore untidy by nature, but it was a useful truth. George V and Queen Mary had built their monarchy on duty, marriage, respectability, church-going, and a manner so solid you could have used it as a sea-wall. Bertie and Elizabeth followed the same pattern in a softer key. They were not glamorous, but they were reassuring. Their home life with two little daughters looked like exactly the kind of domestic steadiness the public wanted from its royals. Set against that, Edward and Wallis looked not modern, but alarming. They looked unstable, they looked improvised. They looked like the sort of arrangement that might work beautifully in private and catastrophically in public. Worst of all, they made the monarchy look as though its moral claims were negotiable when the right dinner guest appeared. Bertie felt the strain perhaps more deeply than anyone except Edward himself. He loved his brother in the battered way siblings often do after a difficult childhood. He admired him at times, resented him at others, and understood from long experience that David could fill a room in ways Bertie never could, yet he also saw what his parents had seen. David wanted the privileges of his position more naturally than he wanted its discipline. Bertie, who found public duty painful, still performed it. David, who found public life easy, often resisted its limits. There is no law saying life must distribute burdens fairly. Elizabeth, Bertie's wife, saw the matter with the piercing clarity of a woman who understood both people and peril. She was charming, sociable, and warm in public, but she was not silly. She knew what the throne demanded of a family. She knew what was being risked. She also knew that if David wrecked his own future, the burden would not vanish into thin air. It would fall on Bertie, who dreaded kingship, and on their elder daughter, the little Princess Elizabeth, who was only 10 years old in 1936 and had no idea that adults elsewhere were quietly deciding the course of her life over cocktails and cabinet papers. Children are often the silent witnesses in royal history. They are in nurseries while constitutions tremble, learning handwriting while grown men discuss the abdication, hearing only scraps of what later defines them. Princess Elizabeth was too young to understand the mechanics, but not too young to absorb atmosphere. Houses grow tense in ways children can feel long before anyone explains them. Doors close differently. Voices sharpen or drop. Adults smile too. Meanwhile, Edward and Wallace continued to build a private world that seemed to him not a threat, but a refuge. Fort Belvedere became more important than ever. There, away from Buckingham Palace and the long corridors of expectation, he could play host, relax into familiar company, and act less like a constitutional monarch, and more like a man arranging life to suit his own taste. He liked comfort, elegance, informality on his own terms. He liked to make domestic choices, to fuss over surroundings, to feel he had created a haven that belonged to him rather than the state. Carefully. Somebody is always away, worried, or whispering. And there was Wallace, clever enough to make that haven feel emotionally necessary. She could steady him, flatter him, needle him back into line, and make him believe that together they formed a unit against an unfeeling world. That is often the most intoxicating kind of bond, the one in which a couple imagine themselves not merely in love but besieged. It converts ordinary criticism into proof of devotion. Every objection becomes a test. Every warning becomes outside cruelty. Very soon anyone who doubts the relationship can be dismissed as heartless, jealous, or trapped in the past. This was catnip to Edward. But it was not simple for Wallace. She had not been born to a throne, had not been raised to revere it from the inside, and did not see royal life through the warm haze of tradition. She saw its absurdities very clearly. She also saw its brutalities. The deference could amuse her. The stiffness could irritate her. The sheer weight of ceremonial expectation could strike her as faintly ridiculous. Yet she was not foolish enough to miss the danger. Becoming the king's intimate companion was one thing. Becoming the woman upon whom a dynasty might break was another. Her husband, Ernest Simpson, occupied the strangest position of all. He was neither hero nor grand villain, merely a man watching his marriage disappear under the wheels of history. Ernest was urbane, businesslike, and not naive about the world he inhabited. He had moved in smart circles, accepted social realities, and seems to have understood that Wallace and the Prince of Wales had become close long before the rest of Britain was allowed to know it. But understanding an arrangement is not the same as controlling it. Once David became king, Ernest was no longer only an embarrassed husband. He was a legal obstacle inside a looming constitutional crisis. The people around Wallace were divided. Some were fascinated and thrilled. Some thought Edward would tire of the attachment, as he had tired of other passions. Some believed Wallace enjoyed the attention but would never force the issue of marriage. Others, more perceptive, saw that the king had crossed into emotional dependency. He called, wrote, arranged, insisted. He hated being separated from her. He was jealous, needy, and increasingly governed by the relationship. This is not the temperament the palace wants in a sovereign. The palace likes self-command. Edward was offering fixation. There were awkward scenes, though not always in public. There were complaints about who had been invited where, who had shown sufficient respect, who had failed to call, who had made some faintly icy remark over the luncheon. Little humiliations accumulated. Queen Mary did not mean to negotiate with scandal by pretending it was merely unconventional. She kept her distance. Others followed her example. Wallis was not formally received at court in the way a respectable future consort might have been, because there was no respectable path to that outcome. Every attempt Edward made to normalize her presence only sharpened the anomaly. And still he pushed. He had another dangerous habit. He increasingly assumed that because he felt something strongly, the nation might eventually be persuaded to feel it too. This confidence was fed by years of crowd adoration. It also came from a genuine, if somewhat undisciplined, sympathy for ordinary people. Edward believed he understood the public better than the older men around him. In some ways he did. He was more modern in touch and instinct. But he badly misread what the public wanted from a king. Admiration for a prince's glamour is not the same as willingness to watch the church, government, empire, and monarchy all bend around his private life. He also misjudged the press. British newspapers kept much of the affair out of print through most of 1936, but silence is not the same as ignorance. Foreign papers were less shy. Americans printed what Britons politely pretended not to know. Travellers carried gossip back and forth. Society talked, diplomats talked, editors knew, members of Parliament knew. The illusion of secrecy survived only because the old barriers between private rumour and public report had not yet fully collapsed. But they were weakening. Once events moved into legal form, paper trails would replace whispers. By the summer of 1936, the shape of the problem was plain to anyone who had the courage to look at it straight. Edward wanted to marry Wallis. That did not mean he had every practical step arranged in a tidy folder. But emotionally and mentally, he was moving toward one conclusion. He believed she was essential to him. He believed the opposition was cruel or antique, or both. He believed some solution ought to be found because he wanted one. Baldwin, whose patience was real but not infinite, had to confront the question more directly. The conversations between king and prime minister had the strained quality of two men speaking from entirely different maps of reality. Baldwin dealt in constitutional limits, church law, cabinet opinion, and the views of the self-governing dominions such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State. Edward dealt in personal conviction, public popularity, and the certainty that a sensible compromise should exist for a man in his position. He floated possibilities. Baldwin blocked them. He wanted room. Baldwin offered walls. A morganatic marriage, one in which Wallis could become his wife without becoming queen, began to hover in discussion as a possible escape. It had existed in some European royal arrangements. To Edward it may have looked like the obvious middle path. To the British establishment it looked alien, fragile, and politically absurd. Britain did not have a neat constitutional shelf on which to place such an experiment. More to the point, those who distrusted Wallis or the whole relationship were not eager to invent new royal machinery for its benefit. One does not usually redesign the crown in order to rescue a man from his own appetites. Edward interpreted this refusal as old-world spite. Baldwin interpreted Edward's persistence as proof that the king had not understood the gravity of his office. Both men were right about the other, and that is one reason the crisis became unavoidable. Then came the divorce. In October 1936, Wallis Simpson petitioned for divorce from Ernest Simpson. It was arranged through the legal forms of the day, discreet in the way such things could be discreet, but it changed the matter decisively. Affection can be denied. Infatuation can be minimized. A filed divorce petition has dates, procedures, court records, and consequences. What had floated for months as an alarming possibility moved into view as an approaching fact. That was the moment when the old protective silence around the king's private life began to look untenable. Inside Britain, newspapers still moved with caution, almost with dread. Outside Britain, the story was no longer containable. A divorced American woman, already once divorced and now divorcing again, appeared to be on the path to marrying the King of Great Britain and Emperor of a vast empire. No editor with a pulse could resist it forever. And at the centre of the coming storm sat three people, each trapped in a different way. Edward, furious that the world would not sanctify his desires. Wallis, who had stepped into a fire and could no longer tell whether she was directing events or being consumed by them. And Bertie, who still hoped, against evidence and temperament and family history, that somehow his brother might stop before duty fell, like a stone, into his own shaking hands. And now the legal obstacle had stepped into the light, which meant the political obstacle could stop pretending to be a rumour. A divorce petition in smart society might ruin a few weekends and one decent seating plan. A divorce petition involving the king's married companion was something else entirely. It moved the matter out of drawing rooms and into official time. It created sequence, paperwork, expectation. The woman around whom the king had wrapped his emotions was no longer merely inconvenient. She was becoming available. That one change forced everyone to stop playing the old game of deliberate vagueness. Stanley Baldwin, who had spent much of 1936 handling the problem with the careful patience of a man carrying nitroglycerin in a teacup, now had to look beyond private warnings and think about government action. In a constitutional monarchy, the sovereign does not simply choose a spouse the way an earl chooses wallpaper. The marriage of the head of state becomes public business, because the spouse does not remain private. She stands beside the crown, shares its symbolism, and alters the institution that millions are being asked to trust. Edward heard this and understood only the part that offended him. He wanted a solution. He did not approach the matter as a man considering whether a thing ought to be done. He approached it as a man certain that what he wanted ought somehow to become possible. He had not lost the habits of the indulged heir just because he had inherited the throne. If anything, kingship intensified them. He was still David underneath the regnal name, still the eldest son who had spent a lifetime half resenting the rules and half assuming they would bend before his personality. Baldwin, by contrast, was a man of systems, patience, and that maddening quality of seeming mild while refusing absolutely to move. He was not dazzled by Edward's charm, nor especially intimidated by his popularity. He understood both, but he also understood Parliament, party discipline, cabinet government, church opinion, and the dominions. The empire by then was not a neat pyramid with London barking orders from the top. The self-governing dominions had their own governments and their own stake in the monarchy. What Britain decided in a matter touching the crown could not simply be announced to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State like an after-dinner preference. They had to be consulted, and what they thought was not encouraging. This was one of Edward's most revealing blind spots. He had travelled the empire, accepted the cheers, worn the uniforms, and absorbed the pageantry, but he did not always seem to grasp the machinery beneath the velvet. He knew how monarchy felt. He was much less patient with how monarchy worked. Crowds had taught him that he was beloved. Ministers were trying to explain that beloved men can still be blocked by institutions older than their feelings. It was not the sort of lesson he enjoyed. The church question remained brutal in its simplicity. As supreme governor of the Church of England, the king was expected to exemplify a standard that the Church itself still upheld. A marriage to a twice-divorced woman with living former husbands was not a matter to be tidied away with a better invitation list. It struck at the visible moral position of the Crown. That did not mean every ordinary citizen was a saint, or even pretending to be one. Britain has never suffered from a shortage of private irregularity. But public standards are often enforced most fiercely by societies that break them in private. A monarchy survives partly by looking more stable than the average dinner table. Edward was asking it to look more flexible than an expensive mattress. There was also the family dimension which, for the palace, was inseparable from the constitutional one. Queen Mary watched events with a cold clarity that Edward would later interpret as hardness, and that she would have regarded as duty. To her, the crown was not a toy for personal gratification, not a decorative hat to be put aside because a son felt misunderstood. It had passed through wars, deaths, scandals, and constitutional strain. It belonged to history and obligation, not emotion. The fact that the danger now came from her own eldest child made it no less dangerous. If anything, it made it worse. Betrayal from within always leaves the deeper stain. Bertie and his wife Elizabeth saw the crisis from a more intimate and exhausting angle. They were not abstractly defending monarchy. They were living under the shadow of what would happen if David forced the matter to the breaking point. Bertie had never wanted the throne. Public duty for him was labour, not theatre. Every speech cost him effort. Every great occasion pressed on his nerves. He did not envy his brother's glamour, but he knew perfectly well that David moved through public life with an ease he himself would never possess. At the same time, Bertie had what David lacked: steadiness, a loyal wife, a settled household, and a capacity to suffer obligation without making a song about it. Elizabeth, the Duchess of York, understood the human cost perhaps most sharply of all. If David stayed king and somehow forced through this marriage, the monarchy would be wounded. If he abdicated, Bertie would be dragged into a role he dreaded, and their two daughters would be altered forever. Their elder child, Princess Elizabeth, would move from being a well-brought-up little girl in a secure branch of the family into the direct path, the crown. Children do not sign constitutional papers, but they pay for them all the same. Through the autumn of 1936, these private anxieties hardened into open constitutional discussion. Edward raised the idea of a morganatic marriage, the continental arrangement by which a king might marry a woman who would not become queen and whose children would not inherit his rank. To him it looked practical, perhaps even generous. He would keep the throne, he would keep Wallace, the state would keep its formulas. Everybody, in theory, would stop objecting. The problem was that Britain had no settled constitutional tradition for such a thing, and the people whose cooperation would be required had very little appetite for inventing one. The dominions were consulted, and the answers that came back were discouraging. Ministers did not want a half-accepted royal wife hovering beside the throne like a permanent constitutional footnote. Churchmen did not suddenly discover flexibility because the king was impatient. Nor were many politicians eager to create a special marital category for a sovereign who already seemed too willing to treat the institution as a negotiation. In truth, the morganatic scheme failed not only because it was unfamiliar, but because so many people at the top had lost confidence in Edward himself. Had the king been widely regarded as judicious, disciplined, and fundamentally reliable, more effort might perhaps have gone into finding a compromise. But he was not. By late 1936, too many people who dealt with him closely had concluded that the marriage question was only the most dramatic expression of a larger difficulty. He did not accept limits well. He disliked tedious duty. He wanted to shape public life personally. He was too often ruled by feeling. a special fix for Wallace looked less like a solution than like another indulgence granted to a man already inclined to confuse personal desire with public right. What made the whole business more combustible was that Edward remained popular with ordinary people who still knew only fragments of the truth. He toured distressed areas in South Wales in November and met men whose lives had been battered by unemployment and industrial decline. He saw poverty, shabby housing, hardship without decent disguise. He could be deeply moved by human suffering, and in this he was not posing. That was part of what made him so complicated. He was not a cold man. He was often too warm in the wrong directions. When he spoke with feeling about the need for conditions to improve, people sensed that he meant it. This public sympathy strengthened his confidence at the worst possible moment. He believed with some reason that he had a direct rapport with the public that older politicians lacked. He thought that if the matter were honestly explained, many people would rally to him. What he missed was the difference between liking a king and wanting him to rearrange the moral and constitutional shape of the monarchy. Crowds cheering a handsome sovereign on tour are not being asked to imagine a twice-divorced consort at the centre of national ceremony. Affection in one context does not automatically transfer to assent in another. But Edward treated popularity like a universal solvent. He assumed it would dissolve the objections in front of him. The British press remained mostly quiet, though by then the silence had become almost absurd. In America and on the continent, the affair was not a secret. Visitors brought newspapers back in luggage. Diplomats filed reports. People in London society behaved as if every dinner napkin were printed with the whole story. The British public still lived in that strange half-world where many had heard something, some had heard everything, and almost nobody had seen it plainly set down in their morning paper. The old compact between press and establishment was reaching the end of its life. It had protected the monarchy for years, but it could not hold forever against legal proceedings, foreign reporting, and the raw size of the story. Wallis herself was under enormous strain by now, and this is where the fairy tale version begins to crack for good. A fairy tale heroine is swept toward destiny. Wallis Simpson was being squeezed from every side, and she was still legally married until the divorce process ran its course. She was being watched, judged, resented, and speculated about on an international scale. She had to navigate Ernest Simpson's position, Edward's emotional dependence, the hostility of the royal family, the disapproval of ministers, and the increasingly vicious public imagination gathering beyond the walls. Her self-possession remained formidable, but self-possession is not the same thing as peace. There is a temptation, especially in later retellings, to imagine her as either the cool architect of everything or the unwilling captive of a man who would not let go. Human beings are seldom so obliging. Wallis could be strategic, ambitious, and hard-headed. She also seems at times to have been startled by the scale of what was happening. To enjoy influence over a prince in private society is one thing. To find yourself positioned as the woman for whom a king might risk his throne is something much darker. There is no evidence that she wanted to become the object upon which the British Constitution sharpened its knives. Ernest Simpson, meanwhile, became the quiet casualty in the corner that polite history often steps around. He was not central enough to command sympathy, and not powerful enough to stop events. His marriage had been outgrown, perhaps long before the crisis burst open, but he still had to stand there, while history used his name as a legal hinge. It was one of the great cruelties of the affair that even its minor figures were denied ordinary dignity. Everyone became symbolic, whether they liked it or not. As the weeks passed, Baldwin became firmer. He made it clear that if Edward chose to marry Wallis Simpson, he could not count on the support of the government for such a marriage while remaining king. This was not melodrama. It was constitutional fact. A sovereign who loses the confidence of his ministers cannot govern in the British system because he does not govern alone. The king may reign, but ministers must answer to Parliament. If they say no together, the Crown discovers the difference between glitter and power. Edward hated this. He felt cornered, moralized at, and betrayed by the very machinery he had inherited. To him, Baldwin's caution looked like stubborn cruelty wrapped in constitutional language. To Baldwin, Edward's insistence looked like emotional blackmail wrapped in romance. Neither man admired the other's perspective. One was talking about personal necessity. The other was talking about state survival. These are not languages that translate cleanly. Outside the cabinet room, anxieties spread in layers. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, had no interest in treating the affair as charming modernity. He thought in terms of national moral witness, sacred office, and the dignity of the Crown. That sort of man was never going to look at Wallis Simpson and see only a private woman in love. He saw disorder dressed as glamour. Others in the establishment may have spoken more softly, but the substance was much the same. The palace and the church had not spent centuries building up royal sanctity simply to watch it reduced to an argument over whether the king should be allowed his preferred house guest. What the palace also feared, though it said this more often in whispers than in formal language, was precedent. If a king could force through this marriage by sheer pressure of will and popularity, what had become of the monarchy's internal discipline? What was left of the old bargain by which the sovereign accepted limits in return for reverence? The institution depended on people believing that the crown stood for something larger than the person wearing it. Edward was making that belief harder to maintain. By late November, the crisis was no longer containable in the old quiet way. Politicians beyond the cabinet knew the essentials. Editors knew the end of silence was close. The legal proceedings surrounding Wallis's divorce made complete suppression almost impossible. Rumour thickened into expectation. And in the middle of it all stood Edward, still hoping he could speak directly to the nation and win the argument over the heads of his ministers. That instinct was revealing and disastrous. It showed how he imagined kingship. He did not see himself only as a constitutional figure bound to ministerial advice. He saw himself as a personal force with a direct emotional relationship to the people, one strong enough to challenge the normal channels of authority. In another age, that might have led to civil war. In the 1930s, it led to alarmed conferences, legal drafting, and men in dark suits explaining that, no, the king could not simply go on the radio and campaign for his preferred marriage like an aggrieved film star. And then one more thing happened, small in one sense and fatal in another. A bishop spoke. On the first day of December, the Bishop of Bradford, in a public address, referred to the king's need for divine grace, and implied gently but unmistakably that the king's private conduct had placed him in want of it. It was not a thunderbolt, just a sentence shaped with clerical care, but it cracked the shell. Once such a remark existed in public from a bishop of the established church, the pretence that nothing definite could be said became ridiculous. Newspapers that had held back now had a peg on which to hang the story. Foreign coverage poured across the channel, with all the delicacy of a flood through a conservatory. The British public, which had been protected from full knowledge far longer than anyone now thought sustainable, woke to discover that the king's private life was not merely colourful, it was the central crisis of the state. And in Buckingham Palace, at Fort Belvedere, in government offices, and in the York household where Bertie and Elizabeth tried to keep their voices calm around their children, everyone understood that the last safe stage had ended. The matter was no longer whether Wallis Simpson was a problem. The matter was whether Edward would choose the woman, the throne, or some fantasy in which he could keep both and force the nation to applaud. Once the story broke into the open, it stopped belonging to the people who had spent months trying to manage it in whispers. That was the first great humiliation. For Edward, who liked to imagine himself at the centre of events, it was intolerable to discover that events had now become larger than his control. For the palace, which prized containment almost as a religion, it was worse. The affair was no longer a difficult private matter. It was the only thing anyone wanted explained. British newspapers, having behaved for months like men pretending not to notice a fire in the curtains, finally began to speak. Not all at once, and not with the full relish later generations might assume, but enough. The public learned that the king intended to marry Wallis Simpson if he could, and that his ministers objected. The pleasant fog that had protected him vanished. Suddenly ordinary men and women who had cheered him as Prince of Wales were being asked a question they had never before considered in practical terms. What exactly was a king allowed to do if what he wanted clashed with what the monarchy was supposed to represent? The answer, as far as the Constitution was concerned, was plain. He was allowed to be disappointed. Edward did not take disappointment like a constitutional philosopher. He took it like a man who thought love should exempt him from procedure. He wanted to speak directly to the nation by radio. This was not a casual whim. It was part instinct, part strategy, and part misunderstanding of his own office. He believed that if he could just explain himself, if he could make the public hear his feelings in his own voice, then the opposition would melt into a puddle of antique nonsense. He had spent too many years being adored not to think this way. He mistook personal magnetism for constitutional authority. His ministers said no. The refusal struck him as outrageous. Why should a king be prevented from speaking to his people? But that question itself revealed the problem. In the British system, a king does not address the public as though he were a candidate fighting his cabinet for moral victory. He speaks on ministerial advice. He does not campaign against his own government. He does not turn the microphone into a weapon against Parliament because his domestic life has become complicated. To Baldwin, allowing such a broadcast would not simply have been imprudent. It would have been revolutionary in the most embarrassing possible way, with velvet curtains and proper diction. Edward saw cruelty. Baldwin saw a last line. The mood around the king grew darker with every day of December. Fort Belvedere, which had once felt like a refuge, began to resemble the command post of a besieged man who kept expecting the walls to apologize. Friends came and went. Advice poured in, much of it contradictory, some of it foolish, a little of it sincere. There were those who told him to stand firm, as if stubbornness could replace a cabinet. There were those who hinted that public opinion would rescue him if only he showed enough feeling. There were others who hoped desperately that Wallis would remove herself from the equation and spare everyone the final collision. That last hope began to shape events. Wallis was by now under a pressure most people would find difficult to bear for an afternoon, let alone as the central fact of their life. She was pursued by reporters, stalked by gossip, blamed for national instability, and watched by every nervous eye in the establishment. The divorce proceedings had put her in legal transit. Her name had become a symbol, her face a provocation, her existence an argument. At the same time, Edward clung to her with increasing desperation. He wanted reassurance, loyalty, confirmation, and immediate emotional certainty, which is a great deal to ask from anyone when the world is collapsing outside the door. She began to fear that she was no longer part of a romance, but the handle on a constitutional grenade. This is where the popular myth usually goes soft and sentimental, as though she floated into history wrapped in perfume and devotion. In reality, the crisis was exhausting and ugly. She appears to have been frightened by the scale of the disaster. She had wanted influence, perhaps. Attention, certainly. A central place in Edward's private life, no doubt. But becoming the woman for whom a king might topple himself from the throne was not a drawing-room triumph. It was a form of public consumption. There were moments when she seems to have wanted out. The most dramatic came when she left Britain for the south of France, trying to escape the press and perhaps to create distance. The move was practical and theatrical all at once, which rather suited the whole affair. In the Riviera sunlight, shielded by wealthy friends and hounded by journalists, Wallis was suddenly both absent from the centre of the storm and more central than ever. Edward was now separated from the woman for whom he was threatening the stability of the crown. The distance did not calm him. It sharpened the sense of melodrama. Letters flew between them. He poured feeling onto paper. She, from all signs, wavered between alarm, loyalty, and the dawning realization that the man she had captivated might truly throw away everything and expect her to stand smiling beneath the wreckage. At Buckingham Palace, the family position hardened into something closer to despair. Queen Mary did not indulge emotional performances. The crown, as she saw it, had been brought into peril by selfishness, dressed up as sincerity. There was no consoling her with speeches about true love. She had lived too long and seen too much. To her mind, the central obscenity was not that Edward loved badly, but that he was willing to place private desire above kingship itself. The monarchy had survived wars and political upheaval by demanding sacrifice from those born to carry it. Her eldest son, in her view, was now demanding that the institution sacrifice itself for him. Mothers may forgive many things, monarchs are less flexible. Bertie was wretched. His brother's crisis had moved beyond gossip and family strain into the terrible realm of consequence. If Edward refused to abandon Wallis and could not keep the throne on those terms, then the crown would come to him. He knew that. Everyone knew that. There was no cheerful way around the order of succession. He had spent his life in the shadow of a dazzling elder brother, and had come to terms with being useful rather than magnetic. Now usefulness was about to become destiny, and he hated the prospect. He did not want to reign. He did not want the speeches, the strain, the public exposure, the burden on his health, or the knowledge that his brother's collapse had made him necessary. His wife understood what this would do to him. She also understood what it would do to their daughter. Princess Elizabeth, 10 years old, could not yet appreciate the full mechanics, but every movement in the family made clear that her life was being redrawn by grown men who would not say so directly in front of her. If Bertie became king, she would become heiress presumptive, first in line while her father lived. A child's future was quietly shifting under the weight of adult appetite. That knowledge made the whole business harder to forgive. It is one thing for a man to ruin his own peace. It is another to place his timid brother and 2 little nieces on the altar of his romantic self-image. Baldwin, meanwhile, kept moving with the patient certainty of a man determined not to let the nation fall into sentimental confusion. He met the king, explained the government's position, consulted ministers, and held the line. There could be no marriage to Wallis Simpson, while Edward remained on the throne with the support of his government. The morganatic idea had failed. The dominions were against it, or deeply cool toward it. The church was against it. The cabinet was against it. Public opinion, once exposed to the real nature of the situation, was by no means the tidal wave of support Edward had imagined. Some sympathized with him, certainly. Some admired his determination. Some believed a king should marry where he wished. But sympathy is not constitutional backing. Admiration is not legislation. He was finding out, very late, that popularity has limits. He was also learning that the people who had cheered him had not all been cheering the same thing. They had loved the prince who seemed vivid and modern, the man who met minors and exuded ease, the future king who looked as if he belonged to the present. That did not mean they wanted a sovereign visibly at war with his ministers and the church over a woman whose life was, by the standards of the day, scandalous. The public can be romantic in theory and stern in practice, especially when the monarchy is involved. People often prefer their rebellions done by other families. The legal clock kept ticking. The divorce would become absolute in due course, unless interrupted. That detail mattered, because some still hoped that delay might produce escape. If Wallace withdrew, if Edward reconsidered, if the public reaction frightened them both, if some last compromise, no matter how unlikely, appeared like a rabbit from a constitutional hat. But every day reduced the room for imagination. The crisis was moving toward a choice. Edward tried, in his own fashion, to postpone the moment at which he would have to see himself clearly. He floated possibilities. He explored whether a speech might still be managed. He listened to bad advice from people who mistook emotional fervour for statecraft. He acted at times like a man expecting the universe to grow embarrassed and step aside. Yet beneath all that motion was one unavoidable fact. If he chose Wallace, he could not keep the throne under the conditions laid down by his government. At last, the alternatives narrowed so visibly that even he could not decorate them any longer. He could give up Wallace and remain king. He could keep Wallace and cease to be king. He could try to force a constitutional rupture and drag the monarchy into open conflict with the government, parliament, church and dominions, which was less a choice than a national tantrum with legal consequences. By then even Edward seems to have understood that the third path was fantasy. He had imagination, but he did not quite have the appetite to become a revolutionary monarch and see where the country landed. He wanted the glow of romantic defiance, not the filthier mechanics of constitutional warfare. That distinction mattered. He was prepared to be dramatic. He was not prepared to be truly destructive in the formal political sense, though many around him feared he had already gone far enough. And so the abdication papers began to take shape. There is something almost offensively neat about constitutional documents at moments of emotional disaster. Pens are filled, text is drafted, signatures are prepared. Language remains calm while lives crack underneath it. That was the case here. If the king chose to renounce the throne, the process had to be formal, legal, and immediate enough to preserve continuity. Monarchy cannot afford a long sobbing pause in the corridor. On the 10th of December 1936 at Fort Belvedere, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. He did so in the presence of his three brothers, Bertie, Henry, and George. It was one of the most extraordinary family scenes in modern royal history, and one of the grimmest. 4 sons of George V together in a country house, gathered not for celebration but for the dismantling of the eldest brother's reign. There is no amount of good tailoring that can make that occasion look normal. One can imagine the textures of it more easily than the words. The paper, the hesitation before the pen touched it, the strain in Bertie, who had not asked for any of this and yet was required to witness the legal collapse that would make him king. The mood in the room, half formal and half unbearably personal. Brothers know each other too well for ceremony ever to conceal everything. Beneath the signatures lay years of family feeling, admiration, resentment, rivalry, disappointment, fear, duty, and whatever remained of childhood loyalties after a lifetime of royal pressure. Edward signed away his throne. The act was both simple and immense, one name on a page and an empire turned a corner. The next day Parliament completed the necessary legislation to give effect to the abdication. Bertie became King George VI. Little Princess Elizabeth became heir presumptive. The whole structure of the royal future moved by one shocking degree, because Edward had chosen not the crown but the woman beside the crisis. This is the point where the fairy tale likes to burst through the door and declare victory. He gave up everything for love. It makes for a graceful sentence if one does not inspect it too closely. In reality, he had not given up everything. He had given up a duty he increasingly disliked, under pressure he could not defeat, in order to preserve the one attachment on which he had made himself emotionally dependent. That is not nothing. It is dramatic, certainly. But it is not the same as some pure act of romantic renunciation floating above history. Others paid for his choice at once, and they paid heavily. He addressed the nation by radio that evening from Windsor Castle, now at last with ministerial approval because he was no longer king. The speech would become famous, especially the line about finding it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. It was beautifully phrased, memorable, and devastatingly effective in shaping the myth. It turned a constitutional crisis into a personal confession. It invited listeners to see a man deprived rather than a sovereign constrained. It took all the great machinery of church, cabinet, dynasty, and law, and made them sound like unfeeling obstacles standing between two human hearts. He was very good at that. It was one of the reasons the palace never forgave him, because the speech did not merely explain, it shifted moral emphasis. It suggested that those who had opposed him were somehow the enemies of feeling, that the issue had really been whether a decent man could be denied the woman he loved. But the people listening in drawing rooms and kitchens, in clubs and servants' halls, were not hearing the whole cost inside that polished sentence. They were not hearing Bertie's dread. They were not hearing Queen Mary's rage and grief. They were not hearing the silent alteration of Princess Elizabeth's life. They were not hearing ministers who had spent months trying to protect the monarchy from a sovereign who had mistaken his wants for constitutional principle. They were hearing a romantic finale. That was the genius of it and the offence. After the broadcast, Edward ceased to be His Majesty and became, by arrangement, the Duke of Windsor. Even the title carried an odd chill, grand but derivative, noble yet unmistakably separate from the main line. It was a rank fashioned for a man who had once held the crown and could not simply be left nameless in Europe. The renaming marked his fall more clearly than any accusation could have done. He had been king, now he was a duke. The institution had stepped away from him, though not yet nearly as far as it eventually would. Before he left Britain, he saw his family in altered form. Bertie was now king, no longer the hesitant younger brother, but George VI. That alone changed the temperature between them. A lifetime of hierarchy had reversed, in substance if not in age. Queen Mary remained cold and wounded. She was not a woman to rush toward emotional reconciliation when the throne had just been shaken loose by her son's conduct. The York household, now the King's household, was already being remade at speed. Staff, rooms, routines, papers, schedules, uniforms and expectations all shifted. The machine of monarchy does not pause to recover anyone's feelings. It simply changes hands and continues, which is both its strength and its cruelty. Edward left for the continent carrying the glamour of a romantic exile and the first real taste of what exile meant. He had imagined escape many times in life, but escape is less delicious when it comes with legal finality and family frost. He had chosen Wallace, yes, he had also chosen separation from the institution that had defined him since birth. The country had not followed him into rebellion, the government had not yielded, the family had not embraced his. Decision with noble tears and understanding smiles, behind him stood a palace that believed it had been blackmailed by emotion, and then publicly blamed for possessing a spine. And the woman for whom all this had been done was still in France, not yet married to him, surrounded by gossip, suspicion, and an atmosphere that could curdle champagne. The throne was gone, the myth was forming. The marriage itself had not even begun. The marriage began, and the palace managed the occasion by not being there. On the 3rd of June 1937, at the Château de Conde in France, Edward married Wallis Warfield, as she was then styled, after her divorce became final. No member of his family attended. That absence said more than any speech ever could. Royal families could make absence sound like weather, but this was judgment. The former king had chosen his path, and the House of Windsor had no intention of dressing it up. With smiles, uniforms, or a cheerful aunt near the flowers. The setting itself was almost too perfect, which is often how history behaves when it wants to be annoying. A French chateau, wealthy friends, a small ceremony, a world of polished surfaces and private arrangements. It looked like romance with good linen. Yet beneath the silk and fresh arrangements sat a harder truth. He was no longer king, she was not becoming queen. The family had not embraced them. The church that had stood in the centre of the crisis had not suddenly opened its arms in delight. The marriage happened, yes, but it happened in exile, under a cloud, and with the unmistakable atmosphere of something half accepted by society and wholly rejected by the institution that had made Edward who he was. Wallis wore blue, the famous shade that would later be called Wallis blue, because when a woman becomes a scandal, people eventually start naming colours after her. Edward looked relieved, proud, and still faintly theatrical, as though he had finally reached the emotional ending he had been writing in his head for months. He had given up a throne. He had crossed the line. He had chosen. For a man who had always hated being cornered, there must have been some fierce satisfaction in stepping into a life that could at least be called his own. But marriages do not live on symbolism. They live on mournings, moods, vanity, money, resentment, boredom, loyalty, and the precise tone used at breakfast. And from the moment the ceremony ended, one fact became impossible to ignore. Edward had not married into peace. He had married into consequences. The first and most bitter came in the form of a title, or rather the withholding of one. Edward had been made Duke of Windsor by his brother, now King George VI. That in itself was a strange compromise between family dignity and institutional distance. He would remain grand, he would remain visible, he would not remain central. The title gave him a place, but not his old place. It was a noble landing after a royal fall. Then came the matter of Royal Highness. George VI confirmed that Edward himself would hold the style of Royal Highness, but Wallis would not. Nor would any descendants, had there been any. She was the Duchess of Windsor, yes, but not Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Windsor. To people outside that world, this may seem like advanced embroidery. To those inside it, it was a blade. The decision enraged Edward. He regarded it as a humiliation inflicted on his wife, and therefore on himself. In one sense he was right. It was a humiliation. It was designed to be one. The palace was saying, with legal neatness and perfect manners, that Wallis had married a royal man, but would not be received as truly royal herself. She would have the Duchess, but not the halo. Status would stop at the edge of her person, like a servant refusing to enter the room. For George VI, the decision served several purposes at once. It protected the dignity of the main line. It reassured the court that the institution had not surrendered. It expressed in the language of rank the family's judgment on the marriage. And perhaps it also did something more personal. Bertie had been dragged into kingship by his brother's wilfulness. He had been asked to save the throne, steady the country, and carry a role he had never wanted. If he now denied Wallis the full royal style, he may have felt he was defending the crown from a further insult. It was not generous. It was not meant to be. Wallis understood insult very well. It was one of the reasons she could survive in society. But surviving a slight and forgetting it are different accomplishments. She never forgot. Neither did Edward. In fact, this single decision poisoned much of what followed. From that point onward, their life together was not merely a marriage. It was a marriage organized around grievance. They were now husband and wife, but also a joint complaint. That complaint had endless uses. Every cold shoulder from a relative, every stiffness in protocol, every omission from the guest list, every hesitation over rank, every adjustment in precedence, every reminder that they stood outside the warm centre of monarchy could be folded into the same bitter story. They had chosen love, and the palace had punished them. There was truth in that. There was also evasion. The palace believed it had not punished love. It had protected an institution from a man who had nearly broken it. Both stories would survive for decades, and both would contain enough truth to remain poisonous. The wedding itself did not repair Edward's relationship with his family. If anything, it clarified the damage. Queen Mary remained severe and remote. She was not inclined to reward disobedience with sentiment. To her, the marriage did not transform scandal into legitimacy. It merely formalized a calamity. Her eldest son had abandoned the crown and placed his younger brother in terrible difficulty. A small French ceremony with tasteful flowers could not alter that arithmetic. George VI was in an even harder position. He was now king suddenly and unwillingly, with a stammer, a crushing sense of responsibility, and a nation studying him for signs of weakness. He had to establish authority quickly, calm the monarchy, and prepare for a coronation that had originally been intended for his brother. He did not have the luxury of behaving like an affectionate. Sibling first and a sovereign second, the order had reversed. Edward, who had always preferred emotional immediacy, felt the reversal keenly. He wanted his brother's love without fully accepting what his brother had inherited from him. The coronation question sharpened everything. The ceremony, scheduled for May 1937, had once been meant to crown Edward and, in theory, some future queen if he had found one acceptable to church and government. Instead it became the coronation of George VI and Queen Elizabeth. That change carried a cruelty that no one needed to say aloud. Every robe, every rehearsal, every carriage route, every piece of music, every archbishop's phrase now belonged to the brother who had never expected any of it. Edward wanted to attend. That was understandable at the human level and impossible at the institutional one. In the end, he stayed away. The absence mattered. It was another formal declaration that the story had split in two. In Westminster Abbey, the monarchy restated itself without him. George VI was crowned in a ceremony heavy with continuity, duty, faith, empire, and deliberate steadiness. Beside him stood his wife, warm, composed, and visibly suitable to the role in all the ways that soothed a frightened establishment. Nearby, though not yet with the full weight of destiny visible to the world, was Princess Elizabeth, now the heir presumptive, whose entire future had been rewritten by her uncle's choices. And where was Edward, the man for whom all of this had once been arranged? Not at the centre, not in the abbey, not in the procession, not where kings belong. He was outside, and he would remain outside for the rest of his life. Exile has different stages. At first, it can feel like relief. There are fewer audiences, fewer red boxes, fewer stiff ceremonies, fewer men explaining why one may not have what one wants. There are lunches in the sun, agreeable houses, travel, flattering hosts, and the thrill of having escaped. Edward and Wallis tasted that stage, and they moved through France and Austria, settled into continental society, and built a life among the rich, the titled, the curious, and the ambitious. They dressed beautifully, they entertained elegantly, they travelled, they remained famous, which was important, because fame was one of the few currencies Edward had always known how to spend. But relief curdles when it is fed on wounded pride. Edward had not spent his life preparing to be a private gentleman in excellent tailoring. He had been raised for the centre. He had been looked at, saluted, obeyed, admired, watched, discussed, photographed, and expected. Even as Prince of Wales, before the crown ever touched him, he had lived under a tension so constant that it became part of his emotional metabolism. To give up the throne was one thing, to live afterward without the daily reinforcement of rank was another. He still wanted to matter on a scale that ordinary private life could not supply. Wallis, for her part, had won the man, but discovered that the prize came attached to permanent atmosphere. She was not joining a contented ex-monarch who had cheerfully swapped public burden for domestic bliss. She was joining a man whose sense of loss would never entirely leave him, and whose favourite interpretation of events cast him as the injured party in history. Living with such a person requires either saintly patience or a taste for permanent campaign. Wallis had much more of the second than the first. Their marriage settled into a style the world found fascinating, and their intimates often found exhausting. They could be charming together, highly polished, witty, socially nimble, and perfectly turned out. They also fed each other's resentments. Edward needed reassurance and devotion. Wallis provided both, though often in tones sharp enough to peel paint. She could scold him, direct him, organize him, and puncture his weaker moods. That had once helped bind him to her. In marriage, it became part of their daily machinery. He clung, she managed, he dramatized, she corrected. He longed for restoration. She learned to live with a man forever glancing backward at a vanished throne and forward at invitations that might prove he still counted. There was affection between them. There was dependence, too, which is not the same thing and often disguises itself as something grander. Edward had built his decision around the belief that he could not carry the burden of kingship without Wallis. Having said that to the world and perhaps to himself for years, he now had to live as if the marriage justified the sacrifice. That is a heavy expectation to place on any union. The spouse ceases to be simply loved and becomes evidence. Every disappointment in the marriage risks becoming a judgment on the abdication itself. Wallis must have known that. It may help explain why their life together became so disciplined in some ways. She took enormous care with appearance, with houses, with clothing, with presentation, with the exact impression made on others. Some women decorate, Wallis curated. There was control in it and defence in it. If the world meant to stare, it would stare at perfection. The rooms would be right, the dinner would be right, the jacket would lie correctly across the shoulder, the life would look composed because too much else about it had been ripped out of place. Yet no amount of polish could solve the central problem. Edward wanted recognition, and the palace wanted distance. This struggle played out over everything. Invitations to family occasions became negotiations wrapped in frost. The question of whether Wallis should be received in certain ways remained permanently sore. British officialdom treated the Duke and Duchess of Windsor with outward civility but inward caution. They were not to be allowed to drift back into the working core of royal life. The family would be polite when required and cold when possible. The message remained fixed. He had left. She had caused pain. Neither would be permitted to rewrite that in satin. For Edward, each slight confirmed his conviction that he had been wronged. He rarely lacked for self-sympathy. The denial of Her Royal Highness to Wallis became, in his mind, a symbol of all the malice and pettiness of the court. He was not entirely wrong. The act was indeed petty in one sense. It was also strategic, and strategy was exactly what the palace believed the moment required. One reason the family never forgave him is that he never fully admitted what he had done to them. He spoke beautifully of love. He did not speak much of the damage. That damage was very real by 1937. George VI was trying to master kingship under immense strain. His wife was carrying emotional weight far beyond what the public could see. Princess Elizabeth's future had changed from sheltered possibility to near certainty. Queen Mary had seen one son fail the crown and another labour to save it. The palace had no appetite for sentimental reconciliation, while the consequences were still unfolding before their eyes. And yet Edward expected reconciliation to arrive as though charm could summon it. There was also a wider world pressing in. Europe in the late 1930s was not a comfortable backdrop for private grievances. It was a continent hardening towards danger. Dictators strutted. Democracies hesitated. Old certainties looked weaker every season. In Britain, George VI had to embody steadiness at a moment when steadiness mattered more each month. Abroad, Edward and Wallace moved among the international rich, untitled, a world that did not always distinguish clearly between glamour, influence, and extremely bad judgment. Edward had another weakness besides vanity and emotional need. He liked important men, especially if they treated him as though he was still important too. Deprived of constitutional centrality, he remained vulnerable to flattery from foreign statesmen, hosts, admirers, and those who recognized how useful his wounded pride might be. He was not the only exiled or sidelined royal to discover that bad regimes can be wonderfully attentive. Authoritarian governments are often very polite to famous people they think they can use. For the moment, though, the danger still wore evening clothes. The Duke and Duchess built their continental life, received visitors and settled into a rhythm that looked enviable from a distance and less restful up close. He had his wife, his title, his wardrobe, and his circle. She had her husband, her status, her houses, and the knowledge that none of it had made her truly acceptable to the family whose history she had helped deflect. They were together, yes, but togetherness is not the same as absolution. The palace, meanwhile, did what institutions do best when wounded. It continued. George VI and Queen Elizabeth occupied the throne with grim devotion. The court reassembled around them. Ceremonies resumed their meaning. The line of succession settled. Princess Elizabeth grew into the role she had never been meant to inherit. So soon Britain began, slowly and with some relief, to imagine that the monarchy might survive not because it had escaped scandal, but because another branch of the family had proved willing to carry what Edward dropped. That success made forgiveness even harder. If the monarchy had collapsed after the abdication, history might have treated Edward as the tragic herald of a doomed system. But the monarchy did not collapse. Bertie and his wife made it work. They steadied it. They humanized it. They restored moral seriousness to it. In a cruel way, their success became part of Edward's condemnation. The family could now see that the throne had not been impossible. It had simply been impossible for him, and he knew it. There is no wound quite like being replaced successfully by the brother one. Had once overshadowed. George VI would never be as naturally dazzling as Edward, never as fluid in a crowd, never as sleekly modern in style, but he proved something far more dangerous to Edward's self-image. He proved that duty, painfully borne, could command deeper respect than charm, brilliantly worn. Once that truth became visible, Edward's old glamour began to look less like promise and more like waste. He could not bear that easily, so he and Wallace leaned harder into the story that remained available to them. They were the wronged couple, they were the elegant exiles, they were the pair who had paid for love while others hid behind precedent and prayer books. It was a good story in drawing rooms. It became much less useful when the world darkened and the kinds of people eager to entertain a resentful former king turned out not always to have decent intentions. The marriage had begun, the grievance had hardened, the palace had drawn its line, and somewhere beyond the polished lunches and private irritation of continental life, a new and more dangerous audience was taking an interest in the Duke of Windsor. That audience soon invited them to Germany, and Edward, who had spent much of his adult life mistaking attention for respect, accepted. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor made a tour of Germany that would stain their names in a way no love story could wash clean. It was presented in the language polite society uses when trying to keep its hands clean. A visit, an inspection, a chance to observe social conditions, labour organisation, housing and public works. The sort of thing that can sound almost admirable if one keeps the lighting soft and forgets who is doing the inviting. But Germany in 1937 was not simply another country trying out fresh ideas in municipal tidiness. It was Adolf Hitler's Germany. The swastikas were not decorative. The camps already existed. The regime's violence, anti-Jewish persecution and police terror were already visible to anyone who wished to see them. Edward wished not to see enough. This was one of his most damaging traits. He could be humane towards suffering when it stood directly in front of him, and flattered his instinct to identify with ordinary people. He was far less reliable when the suffering came wrapped in ideology, bureaucracy, and state spectacle, especially if the men running that spectacle treated him as a figure of consequence. The German regime understood vanity as well as any courtier at Windsor. It knew how to arrange receptions, flattering itineraries, respectful officials, clean factories, smiling workers, and the grand old seduction of making an exiled man feel central again. Edward responded as many shallow political minds do when faced with efficient evil. He mistook stage management for substance. The visit was a public relations gift for the Nazis. Here was the former King of Great Britain, the man who had thrown away the throne and remained famous. Across the world, now travelling through the Third Reich with his wife, inspecting, saluting, smiling and lending social glamour to a dictatorship. Desperate for legitimacy, German officials showed the Windsors model settlements and labour projects. They displayed order, discipline and purposeful national direction. Edward, who disliked parliamentary muddle and had a weakness for strong personalities, seemed impressed by what he saw. He had always found the slow compromise of democratic politics less thrilling than direct action. In Germany he encountered direct action with excellent choreography. Then came the meeting with Hitler. On the 22nd of October at the Berghof in Bavaria, the Duke and Duchess met Hitler in person. The photographs are still enough to make one wince. There they were, posed amid all the poisonous symbolism of the age, treating the leader of Nazi Germany as a host of consequence rather than the architect of a murderous regime. No one needed Edward to predict the full scale of what was coming. History does not require clairvoyance before it expects judgment. By 1937, plenty was already known. Jews were being hounded from public life. Political opponents had been crushed. Brutality and intimidation were not rumours. They were policy. A man did not need to know the future to know enough. The palace never forgot that meeting, nor did the government. Whatever lingering tenderness some may once have had for the romantic exile started to curdle into something colder. An abdication for a woman was one thing, cozying up to Hitler was another. The House of Windsor had spent generations trying to look like the stable moral centre of British public life. Edward had now attached the family name, however indirectly, to one of the vilest regimes in Europe, and he had done it at a time when Britain itself, was edging nervously toward the greatest threat it had faced in decades. Why did he do it? Vanity explains part of it, so does grievance, so does political shallowness. Edward had not become a convinced Nazi ideologue in the strict doctrinal sense. He was something more common and, in some ways, almost as dangerous. He was a man with poor judgment, authoritarian sympathies, resentment toward his own establishment, and a fatal susceptibility to foreign flattery. He saw in Germany energy, order, and decisive leadership where wiser observers saw terror, lies, and a cult of power. He also liked the fact that the Germans treated him with a respect he believed his own family had denied him. Wallis's role remains harder to pin down with certainty, but she too moved through these circles with unnerving ease. She was no simple innocent being escorted through European politics with her eyes shut. She was socially alert, deeply attuned to status, and perfectly aware that the visit was helping to restore a sense of grandeur to their lives. Whether she shared Edward's political foolishness in full is less clear than the fact that she accepted the setting, the honours, the access, and the company. That alone was enough to poison opinions in London for years. The German visit mattered not just because it was foolish, but because it confirmed the darkest suspicions of those who had opposed him during the abdication. They had feared a man too ruled by feeling, too eager for personal relevance, too willing to blur public responsibility with private appetite. Now they had proof that, out in the world, free from the constraints of the throne, he might lend his name to causes and men of appalling character merely because they made him feel important. In a bitter way, the visit justified the whole resistance to him. If he could behave like this as a former king, what might he have done had he remained the actual one? As Europe darkened, Edward's remarks did not help. He sometimes spoke in ways that suggested admiration for German economic recovery, or sympathy for the argument that harsh treatment after the First World War had contributed to German fury. That last point, taken alone, was not absurd. Many thoughtful people had believed the peace settlement too severe. The problem was that Edward's observations so often drifted toward excuse and simplification. He seemed to underestimate the moral monstrosity of Nazism and overestimate the virtues of forceful leadership. He disliked communism, distrusted left-wing unrest, and could sound dangerously willing to see fascism as a rough corrective to democratic disorder. Men of his class all over Europe made the same mistake. He simply made it more embarrassingly. The British government, already uneasy, became increasingly concerned that the Duke of Windsor might be used by foreign powers, or by domestic cranks who dreamed of political alternatives in a time of fear. There were those in Germany who believed Edward had been badly treated by his own country, and might prove useful in the event of war or constitutional fracture. The notion that he could become some restored or alternative monarch under German pressure was not merely the fever dream of novelists. German officials took enough interest in him for British authorities to worry seriously. War in 1939 changed the atmosphere at once. Europe ceased to be a stage for elegant grievance and became a battleground. George VI and Queen Elizabeth stayed in Britain, doing precisely what a monarchy under threat was expected to do. They represented endurance, shared danger, and public steadiness. Their daughters remained part of that image of national continuity. The royal family, once wounded by Edward's abdication, now had a chance to define itself through service and courage. The contrast with Edward grew harsher by the month. At first, he was given a military post in France as a British liaison officer. It sounded respectable enough and perhaps even useful. But his presence was always delicate. He was a former king, a duke with opinions, a man who talked too freely, and someone whose judgment the government distrusted. reports accumulated that he made indiscreet remarks about the war, British weakness, and the likelihood of German victory. Whether every story later told about him was entirely fair is less important than the fact that enough concern existed to alarm Winston Churchill and others at the top of government. The German advance in 1940 turned concern into urgency. After the fall of France, Edward and Wallace moved through the chaos towards Spain and then Portugal, as Europe collapsed around them. Their position at that moment was extremely dangerous in every sense. They were prominent, politically compromised, and in reach of regimes friendly to Germany. There were genuine fears in London that the Duke might become a pawn, willingly or otherwise, in German plans. The Germans themselves explored possibilities. They believed Edward might be manipulated, perhaps even restored in some puppet arrangement if Britain were defeated or forced into terms. That idea said as much about Nazi opportunism as about Edward himself, but the fact that it could be imagined at all was ruinous. There were intercepted communications, rumours, diplomatic manoeuvrings, and enough evidence of German interest to convince British leaders that something had to be done. Churchill, who had his own complicated feelings about monarchy, saw the danger clearly. Edward needed to be removed from continental entanglements and placed somewhere far from European intrigue, political mischief, and the possibility of becoming a decorated hostage to his own vanity. The solution was elegant in the way only imperial solutions can be. He was appointed Governor of the Bahamas. If there is a harsher demotion in modern British royal life, it is difficult to find. A former king now sent across the Atlantic to a colonial governorship in Nassau, not because he had displayed such statesmanlike wisdom that he was indispensable overseas, but because London wanted him somewhere safe, distant, and contained. He accepted, though hardly with delight. One suspects he understood the insult perfectly. In public, it was service. In private, it was exile with office attached. The Bahamas were beautiful, but beauty is not always enough to soothe injured rank. Edward and Wallace arrived in Nassau in August 1940 and found a place that was warm, lush, unequal, and far from the European society in which they preferred to move. The colony had its own politics, racial tensions, poverty, and social divisions. It was not some tropical stage set placed there to console a disappointed duke. It was a real place with real human problems. Edward, to his credit, did take an interest in some local conditions, but he was not happy. He found the posting second-rate, confining, and unworthy of his sense of himself. Wallace loathed much of it even more openly. Their life there quickly became a mixture of protocol, discomfort, and boredom relieved by complaint. Government House could be made stylish, of course. Houses were one of the few things Wallace could reliably bend toward order. There were dinners, visitors, local ceremonies, and efforts to maintain standards. But standards were not the same as satisfaction. Nassau was not Paris. It was not the Riviera. It was not the centre of anything they valued. The Duke and Duchess had not given up the throne to end up in a colonial outpost, feeling watched by London and stranded in humidity. The posting also exposed something unpleasant in Edward's character that the palace had long suspected. He could show sympathy in selected human encounters, but as governor he could sound tone-deaf, patronising, and indifferent to the broader structures of injustice around him. The colony's poverty was severe, labour unrest was real, racial inequality was entrenched. Edward did not create those conditions, but he moved through them with the breezy assumptions of a man raised to be served, not a reformer, prepared to risk comfort or class solidarity for serious change. When a strike and riot broke out in 1942, he had to confront unrest directly. The episode forced him into real administration and real conflict, not the abstract gestures he preferred. He managed, but without distinguishing himself as a visionary or a deeply trusted local leader. All the while the larger war raged. London was bombed. Britain endured the Blitz. George VI and Queen Elizabeth stayed in the country, visiting bombed districts, facing danger and quietly deepening the moral authority of the Crown. Princess Elizabeth grew up under wartime strain, taking on more visible duties as she matured. Her future tied ever more clearly to service and national endurance. The monarchy that Edward had abandoned was acquiring a wartime dignity he could never reclaim. This, more than almost anything, hardened the family's feelings. If the abdication had merely been a private sorrow, time might perhaps have softened it. But war gave George VI a chance to prove himself, and he did. The timid younger brother became a symbol of courage under pressure. The wife Edward had once perhaps underestimated became one of the most effective public queens Britain had ever seen. The little niece whose life he had altered became a princess, associated with duty, discipline, and the shared burdens of the nation. The House of Windsor, far from collapsing after his departure, was being morally strengthened by the very trials from which he was absent. Edward could not bear that contrast without resentment. He had once been the charismatic future. Now he was the awkward relation in Nassau, making barbed remarks, feeling underused, and watching history assign greatness elsewhere. He wrote, complained, and cultivated the old story of neglect. He believed the family had cast him out too coldly. He believed he and Wallace were denied the honours due to them. He believed he had talents that Britain was wasting. One can hear, underneath all of it, the voice of the spoiled heir, who never accepted that some doors had closed because he himself had slammed them first. The marriage by now had fully settled into its permanent mode. Edward adored Wallace, with a dependence that was half devotion and half habit. He deferred to her tastes, feared her disapproval, and leaned on her emotionally. She, in turn, ran their world with sharp efficiency. She organized the details, steered the tone, and managed him in the cutting, unsentimental manner that had first fascinated him years earlier. There was loyalty in that arrangement. There was also fatigue. A marriage built on crisis must eventually learn how to survive ordinary time. And ordinary time in Nassau was not romantic. It was heat, protocol, local politics, gossip, and two people trying to maintain the glamour of exile while feeling abandoned by the roles they thought history owed them. Money was another recurring irritant. They were not poor, far from it, but Edward's expectations had always exceeded his settled resources. There had been financial arrangements after the abdication, bitter disputes over what George VI would provide, and a long aftertaste of grievance about property, allowances, and the material recognition Edward felt was due to him. Wallace liked luxury, and Edward liked the life that signalled rank. Both required money. Their position was never desperate in the ordinary sense, but it was never as grandly secure as their style suggested. This sharpened dependence on wealthy friends, social networks, and favourable treatment, which in turn encouraged more resentment whenever the family refused some symbol of full acceptance. It also deepened another problem: to live as elegant outsiders constantly. Measuring what one has against what one believes one deserved is to invite bitterness into every room. The Windsors did this almost professionally. A missing style, a withheld invitation, a cool letter, a precedence issue, a financial slight, an ungracious comment from a courtier. Any of these could fuel weeks of complaint. The marriage survived, yes, but part of what kept it alive was shared injury. Wallace and Edward were never more united than when discussing how badly they had been treated. By the middle of the war, the pattern was fixed beyond much hope of repair. The British state did not trust Edward fully. The royal family did not forgive him. The public, increasingly attached to George VI and his household, no longer saw the Duke of Windsor as the lost, golden king of romantic legend. He had become something stranger and less flattering. He was the man who had abandoned the throne, embarrassed the monarchy, flirted with dangerous regimes, and then spent the war in a colonial posting far from the centre of sacrifice. And still he thought at intervals that perhaps one day he might be restored to greater closeness, greater use, greater recognition. That hope, never entirely extinguished, was one of the saddest features of his life. He never stopped imagining that the family might eventually admit he had been right to choose as he did and wrong to be treated as he was. The family, meanwhile, looked at the same years and saw proof piled upon proof that they had been justified from the start. By the time the war moved toward its end, the real question was no longer whether the palace would forgive Edward. It was whether Edward himself would ever understand why it could not. He did not understand it, not fully, not to the end. That was part of the tragedy and part of the irritation. Edward could recognize slights with the sensitivity of a man feeling for splinters in silk, but he was far less gifted at tracing other people's injuries back to himself. When the war ended in 1945, Europe was exhausted, cities were broken, empires were beginning to loosen, and Britain had survived at terrible cost. The monarchy emerged from the war not glittering, but fortified. George VI had become, almost against his own nature, the right king for a frightened nation. He had stayed, he had worked, he had endured. His wife had proved magnificent in exactly the way the royal establishment prizes most. Not dramatic, not rebellious, not clever for its own sake, but steady, warm, and utterly equal to the role. Their elder daughter, Princess Elizabeth, had grown into young womanhood under the discipline of wartime duty and public expectation. The crown Edward had abandoned was no longer trembling from his departure. It was being strengthened by the family he had forced into the breach. That was not a comforting fact for him. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor left the Bahamas in 1945. Their years there had never become the noble chapter of public service that some in London may have hoped to paste over the more awkward truths. Nassau had been a holding pen with palm trees. Edward had never ceased to feel underused, diminished, and unjustly parked at the edge of relevance. Wallace had never ceased to regard the place as provincial exile with insects. When the posting ended, they returned to a life that looked freer and more glamorous, but was in some ways even emptier. They settled chiefly in Paris, took a house in the Bois de Boulogne, and built the sort of existence that elegant outsiders have perfected for centuries. Lunch, fittings, correspondence, dinner, visitors, social manoeuvring, and the daily management of appearances. And appearance mattered enormously. If one cannot be central, one can at least be impeccable. Wallace became the presiding genius of surfaces. Clothes were not mere clothes, rooms were not mere rooms. Chairs, flowers, curtains, table settings, jewels, linens, luggage, cigarette cases, the angle of a hat, the line of a cuff, all became part of a defensive art. Perfection can be armour, and in Paris she wore it well. Society responded. The Windsors were famous, entertaining, and useful to the international rich. They moved among aristocrats, industrialists, social climbers, fashion figures, old friends, new flatterers, and that special breed of people who never miss a chance to dine near damaged royalty. Edward liked the life because it gave him what he still craved, attention without responsibility. He could be charming at table, anecdotal, amused, and gently self-pitying, which is a combination many hostesses find oddly irresistible. He knew how to enter a room and improve it. He had decades of practice. But the life also exposed the emptiness beneath the polish. He had once possessed the grandest public role in the English-speaking world. Now he possessed invitations. A man can dine very well and still know he has fallen. The grievance remained the spine of everything. The argument over Wallace not being granted Royal Highness never ceased to poison relations. It became a kind of sacred wound in their household, proof that the family had not merely disagreed with the marriage, but meant to degrade it. Edward returned to the issue again and again in letters and conversation, as though enough repetition might one day force the royal family to feel ashamed. It never did. If anything, the insistence only reminded them why they had made the decision. They saw in it exactly the same pressure they had resisted in 1936. His belief that because he desired a thing intensely enough, the institution ought to find a way to grant it. George VI did not grant it, nor did he welcome his brother back into the inner workings of royal life in any substantial way. There were contacts, meetings, occasional visits, the careful exchange of family feeling and family frost that marks many aristocratic relations. But there was no restoration, no serious role, no warm return to the centre. The Duke remained what he had become in 1936, a royal relation to be handled, not trusted. This hurt him more than he liked to admit, which is saying something because he liked to admit hurt quite a lot. He could sound wounded over rank, invitations, money, houses, protocol, press treatment and family tone. There were endless wrangles over finances. Before the abdication, the family wealth and the property arrangements of a reigning sovereign had been wrapped together in ways ordinary people do not have to spend their afternoons considering. After the abdication, the separation of what was personal, what belonged to the crown, what had been inherited, and what should be paid, became a source of bitterness. Edward believed he had been financially short-changed. George VI believed he had inherited a disaster, and was not obliged to reward it lavishly. Neither brother would ever have made a good bookkeeper for the other. The deeper wound, though, lay in comparison. Every year George VI remained on the throne was another year of proof that duty, not dazzle, was what the job required. He was not naturally glib. He was not fluid in public. Speeches cost him, ceremony cost him, decision cost him. Yet he bore the cost. That was precisely what made people admire him. He did not look like a man born to effortless majesty. He looked like a man labouring against himself because the country needed him to do it. Nations are moved by that sort of struggle. It flatters their own sense of effort. Edward, who had always been better at seeming than enduring, could not compete with it. Nor could Wallace. She had style, intelligence, social reflexes, and formidable self-control. What she did not have and never would have was the quality the British monarchy values most in its women, the ability to disappear into duty while somehow becoming beloved through it. Queen Elizabeth, later known to the world as the Queen Mother, had that quality in abundance. Wallace had almost the opposite gift. She entered a room and made it feel more interesting. She rarely made it feel safer. That difference, while unfair in some ways, was fatal in royal terms. By the late 1940s, the Windsors lived in a strange category. They were too grand to be ordinary, too compromised to be central, too famous to be ignored, too inconvenient to be embraced. Paris suited that in-between state. It was a city where old names, impeccable manners, and questionable history could all be seated together if the wine was good enough. Edward and Wallace entertained, shopped, travelled, and preserved their image. They became fixed points. In a world that loved elegance and tolerated moral untidiness, provided it came with decent silver. Then in 1952 came one more family turning point, and with it another reason the palace could not simply forgive and forget. George VI died in February 1952, worn down by strain, smoking, illness, and years of responsibility he had never sought. He was only 56. His death elevated Princess Elizabeth to the throne as Queen Elizabeth II while she was still a young woman. The little girl whose future had been altered by Edward's choices in 1936 was now sovereign. His abdication had not merely embarrassed his brother. It had changed the age, the circumstances, and the emotional path by which his niece came to power. There is a special kind of silence around such facts in royal families. No one sits down over tea and says, "You see, this is all because of you." One does not need to. The line of causation stands in the room by itself. Edward attended the funeral and the ceremonies around the accession with the awkward dignity of a man forced to appear in a story whose emotional logic condemns him. By then he was no longer the romantic centre of a national memory. He was the uncle who had once been king and then chosen otherwise. Elizabeth II received him correctly, but she was not a sentimental woman in matters of duty. She had learned from parents and grandmother alike what the crown cost and what had been required to preserve it. Her view of her uncle was shaped not by fairy tale but by inheritance. She could be polite. She could even be kind within limits. What she could not be was forgetful. The new Queen's reign only made Edward's decision look more consequential with every passing year. Elizabeth became, in time, the embodiment of precisely the values he had resisted: constancy, discipline, endurance, the suppression of personal preference in service of an institution. Her life, viewed from the palace perspective, was the answer to his. Not because she was joyless, but because she accepted the terms. She did not ask the crown to bend around her emotional needs. She bent herself around the crown. That was the bargain. Everyone in the family knew it. Edward had refused it. Elizabeth fulfilled it so completely that his refusal looked not romantic but juvenile. He tried occasionally to shape the story in his favour. In 1951 he published A King's Story, his memoir, which naturally did what memoirs so often do. It presented his motives in the best available light and arranged the past so that feeling came out looking nobler than institutions. He wrote well enough, remembered selectively, and offered the familiar emphasis on personal sincerity. Readers could still be moved by him. That was part of the problem. Edward had always been good at making his own emotional weather sound universal. But memoir does not repair trust, especially when those he hurt are still busy living with the consequences. The palace, for its part, had no intention of reopening the case in public. It did not need to. Silence served perfectly well. The family did not produce dramatic counter-memoirs in which they announced that the former king had been selfish, vain, politically gullible, and emotionally exhausting. They simply carried on, which was much more damaging. The more the monarchy continued with dignity, the less persuasive Edward's self-justification became. There was also the shadow of the German years, which never fully disappeared. After the war, captured German documents and intelligence reports added detail to the already unpleasant picture of Edward's wartime foolishness and the extent of Nazi interest in him. He had not just gone on an embarrassing pre-war tour and admired the wrong sort of efficiency. He had, in the eyes of British officialdom, shown himself so indiscreet and so politically unreliable that foreign powers considered him potentially useful. Even when the public version of these matters emerged only gradually, the state had known enough. The family had known enough. Forgiveness becomes rather difficult when there are files. This did not stop the Windsors from living splendidly where they could. Their Paris house became famous for its exact taste and controlled atmosphere. They mixed with fashion designers, industrial fortunes, titled Europeans, American hostesses, and the permanent international class that lives halfway between glamour and vacancy. Wallace remained a style icon. Edward remained an object of fascination. A man whose life allowed people to indulge in one of society's favourite games, imagining that they would have done the same for love, while quietly enjoying not having to test the matter with a throne. Yet even their social success carried a faint smell of exclusion. Truly central, royalty do not need to market themselves. They do not need to turn every dinner into a reaffirmation of status. They do not need to cultivate a life so polished that the polish itself starts to look anxious. The Windsors needed all of that. They had to keep proving something, perhaps to the world, perhaps to each other, perhaps to themselves. A life built on renunciation acquires a terrible need to look worth it. Did they love each other? Yes, in their fashion, but love in their case was not a meadow. It was a contract written over a crater. Edward depended on Wallace with a constancy that could look moving or burdensome depending on the day and the observer. He wanted her approval, her company, her management, her steadiness, her sharpness, even her scolding, which had become one of the sounds by which he measured intimacy. She in turn gave him structure, presence, social intelligence, and the discipline of a shared world. She could also be cutting, impatient, and emotionally cool. He needed warmth in forms she did not always naturally provide. She needed control in a life that had been made chaotic by his needs. They fit, but not softly. There were no children to soften the edges or complicate the inheritance. That mattered. Children can bind a family to the future even while they complicate the present. Edward and Wallace had only each other, their household, and their grievances. The absence of descendants made their story feel curiously sealed, as if it ended where it began, with two adults and an argument about what was owed them. As the decades moved on, Edward aged into a figure almost trapped by his own myth, the handsome prince of the 1920s, the romantic exile of the late 1930s, the awkward wartime governor, the elegant Parisian duke. All these versions of him sat uneasily together. He still enjoyed attention, but age changes the terms of social triumph. Younger people arrive, styles shift, dinner tables become crowded with people who know you more as anecdote than as danger. He could still charm, but charm had to work harder against memory. His health declined in the later years. Smoking had done its work, among other things, and by the end of the 1960s he was increasingly frail. There were some efforts at family contact. He saw members of the royal family occasionally. In 1972, Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip visited him in Paris, shortly before his death. The image carries a kind of late, formal tenderness. The niece who wore the crown because he had not now came to see the uncle who had abandoned it. That does not amount to forgiveness. It amounts to family behaving correctly in the face of mortality, which is both less dramatic and more meaningful. Edward died on the 28th of May 1972 in Paris, aged 77. He was buried at Frogmore in the Royal Burial Ground near Windsor. Even in death the arrangement was symbolic. He came back physically to the soil of the family, but not to the centre of its sacred spaces. Wallace survived him by many years, though in increasingly sad condition. Frail and isolated toward the end, a woman who had once bent rooms to her will and now lived under the long, dimming afterlight of one of the century's most famous scandals. She died in 1986 and was buried beside him. So why did the palace never forgive Edward VIII? Not because he fell in. Love. Royal history could scarcely function if love alone were a hanging offence. Kings, princes, queens, and princesses have loved badly, unwisely, inconveniently, and often enough repeatedly. The real wound was deeper. He had revealed under pressure that he did not see the crown as they saw it. To Queen Mary, to George VI, to Elizabeth II, and to much of the palace world, monarchy was not a stage for personal fulfillment. It was an inheritance of duty held in trust. One could suffer under it, even privately resent it, but one did not demand that it remake itself around a sovereign's emotional emergency. Edward did demand that. When refused, he chose himself. Then, having chosen himself, he invited the world to admire the choice as noble sacrifice. That was the second offence. His famous broadcast did not simply resign, it moralized. It cast him as the man of feeling and others as the custodians of coldness. It laid a romantic veil over a constitutional crisis in which ministers, family, church and empire had been forced to protect the monarchy from its own head. The palace never forgave being turned into the villain of his love story because, from its point of view, it had been the adult in the room. The third offence was what followed. His pre-war conduct around Nazi Germany, his wartime indiscretion, his resentment, his inability to accept the legitimacy of the limits placed on him, all confirmed the worst fears of those who had opposed him. He did not spend the decades after abdication proving that he had been misunderstood. He spent many of them proving that he was exactly as unreliable as they had feared, just in better tailoring. And finally, there was the matter of cost, because his choice did not land lightly. It broke his mother's heart in a way she never quite hid. It terrified and burdened his brother, who paid for the crown with health and years. It altered the childhood and destiny of Elizabeth II, who would spend a lifetime fulfilling the duty he had set aside. It forced the monarchy through one of its greatest 20th century convulsions and left scars in the family that protocol could cover, but not heal. People can forgive injury done to themselves more easily than injury done to someone shy, dutiful, and undeserving. Bertie had never asked to be king. That alone made Edward's behaviour harder to pardon. The world preferred the simpler story. It always does. A man gave up everything for the woman he loved. That version fits on postcards and in film scripts and in the soft corner of the human mind that wants feeling to outrank structure. But the truth is less flattering and far more interesting. Edward did not surrender a throne because love conquered all. He surrendered it because he could not reconcile the crown with his own needs. And when forced to choose, he chose the one relationship that made him feel seen, soothed, and affirmed against a lifetime of family coldness and institutional restraint. That is not nothing. It may even be understandable, but it is not the same as nobility. And the palace, which had to live with the bill long after the romance had taken its bow, knew the difference.